Okay, good. Hey, Vesela.
Hello.
How are you?
Doing great. I was looking forward to our conversation today.
So Vesela and I decided to have a chat today about the topic of centering, which I definitely feel is a really important topic and a useful ability right now. And I think Vesela agrees. Well, where should we jump in? Maybe we can start talking a little bit about what centering means to each of us, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, when I say that word centering or to center, what sort of comes up for you?
For me, centering is very similar to feeling grounded. And the way I experience myself being centered and grounded is when I'm fully present in my body. My mind is not distracted, my thoughts are not scattered. I'm really here and now, and I feel my whole being present with the situation I'm in. And if I were to put that in contrast with how I feel when I'm not centered or not grounded, it can range anything from being distracted, being overwhelmed, not being able to prioritize my tasks for the day, thinking about many things at once, worrying, not feeling my body, like not experiencing my emotions, not being aware of my emotions, basically not feeling myself, I would say. That's how I experience it, and it can range anything from, as I mentioned, distraction or checking out and not feeling present in the situation, to the other end of the spectrum, which is anxiety attack or panic attack, I would say.
Okay, so at an extreme, yeah, it might go to something like panic or anxiety. And part of what we're hoping, I think, or what I'm hoping for this talk is in distinguishing some of the properties of being centered, it will give everyone an opportunity to experience that and have some ways of accessing it in this time now with this coronavirus going on, especially. One thing that really has occurred to me recently is that the utility or the value in being centered has really occurred to me over the last couple of weeks, both having the experience of being in this situation myself and seeing other people in this situation, and essentially seeing people knocked off center. And I think the time when I notice what it's like to be centered is right when I'm knocked off. Like if I'm in anxiety and then finally it starts to subside, I might feel like I'm coming back to center. I'm coming back to home base. And like you were saying, being present, I think, is one property of feeling centered. Another is not feeling pulled somewhere else.
Yeah.
So maybe that's another way of this, there's nothing that's taking my mind out of this moment. So I'm available for whatever's going on here. Yeah. And, in Buddhism, we say, your mind isn't going to the future and it's not going to the past.
Yeah.
That you're actually for a moment here. And I think it's okay to, I think we have experiences of observing the future or observing the past from a centered place, which is very different than being pulled into one of those or lost in one of those.
Yeah. And I think many times the reason we get pulled in one direction or another is because we're trying to control too much. we're trying to control what will happen in the future, so we are overthinking it. We regret because things didn't go well or the way we wanted in the past, so we're getting pulled in the past. And it's just trying to control all of these can make us be off center as well, I think.
I think that's a good point. And I think one way of coming back to center is perhaps relinquishing some of that need to control.
Yeah.
You know, and sort of, you know, that people say being comfortable with what is, or being present, just being present with what's happening without trying to change it. And for a moment, just letting things be is one way of returning to center.
I love it.
That's something else that I wanted to talk about is what are some times and places where you experience being centered, or what are some of the ways that you get there yourself?
Yeah. Which question would you like me to answer first?
Yes, yeah, either one.
So I feel most centered and most myself when I do something I love and I'm passionate about. And I'm fully in the flow and I'm so present, nothing can take me away. And it could be when I meditate, it could be when I teach meditation or mindfulness or help a client or a group. It really makes me very centered. And I think one of the reasons is because I want to give people so much and I want to help them so much that I forget about everything else and I'm fully here with my attention to them. So that makes me really centered and present and grounded. And it takes the focus of me and the focus is somewhere else, to a person, a group of people, because I really want to help them. When I have had moments of being off-centered, what has helped me feel centered and grounded is meditation. So I meditate every day. And I have a special place, a mountain, Zen mountain monastery, Zen monastery in the mountains, which is really, for me, it's the greatest anchor for being grounded and centered. So sometimes when I feel off center, I would just pause and imagine myself being there meditating. Something else that is helpful and I would recommend to people who have had anxiety or panic attacks. I have had 2 in my life. It wasn't a great experience. So something that has helped me in that moment is to focus on my senses, because in that kind of moment, you're feeling so overwhelmed by physical sensations, emotions, or whatever is happening in your mind that it's almost like you don't feel yourself. So the way that I have found to bring myself back to the moment and to be with the experience and to go over it is when I focus on my senses. So I look around and notice things that I'm seeing. I feel, I touch something to allow myself to feel my physical presence. I focus on the sounds or voices I'm hearing. If I'm eating something, I try to focus my taste to taste it better. So focusing on any of the 5 senses is really helpful to bring ourselves back to center and to feel more grounded.
That's great. And I think those are 2 very practical and useful ways of accessing the feeling of being centered. One being, I'm going to abstract from what you said, really recalling a time or a place where you just naturally feel centered. You know, for you, it's Zen Mountain Monastery. I go to a different monastery and I have different places. You know, for me, it's being out in the middle of the woods, and I live in the middle of the city. So, but being able to mentally give myself a moment and put myself there and really feel what's going on around me there brings me back to center, begins to calm down my breathing and my nervous system. And yeah, I start to access that state. You know, in NLP, we talk about anchoring, which is a term, you know, about how do you access a state intentionally. And one way of doing that is really just by getting good at recalling times and places when you had that state. And it's almost like you're paving a roadmap so you know how to get back there.
Yeah.
And eventually you get good at accessing that state. You're really practicing being in that state. So recalling times is a great way of doing it. And then the second way that you described, which is really becoming present to your senses and really paying attention to whatever's going on. And I would extend that even to paying attention to whatever, even if you're experiencing an unpleasant emotion, being present to that is another way of actually beginning to center and calm yourself down. So
I agree.
um,
Would you like to share any experience with what makes the woods, the forest, when you're being there? Anything else that you would suggest to our listeners that they might want to do? Or
well, I think there are a couple other ways that I experience being centered, or that I group with that, and some of it comes from Aikido, basically. And it, you know, in Aikido, everyone talks about accessing your center, and what being centered in Aikido, part of what it refers to is being in a stance where you're not forward, you're not leaning forward, you're not leaning back. You're literally centered, so you're available to move to either of those places very easily. You're not in an overly fixed, rigid position, but you're more supple and you're able to move with things. So for me, practicing physically centering my body, you know, like you're sitting up straight, like we both meditate a lot, so we do that. But for folks who don't do that, getting in the practice of having your spine straight and noticing, do you naturally lean back and sort of collapse, or are you leaning forward? And, you know, and finding, okay, where's this midpoint, and even moving side to side and finding a midpoint, that can be a very powerful way of centering. Another image that comes to mind for me comes from sword fighting, and with doing weapons work or sword fighting, there's this image of, they say it's like holding a bird in your hand, and it's like just enough tension that you'd be able to hold the bird, but not enough that you would damage. And so it's kind of a loose firmness. And so for me, that kind of image also brings me back.
I love that.
Yeah. So yeah, those are some of the ways that I get there.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you as well. Should we pause there?